Gracias. Muy bien. Uh, bueno. Okay, welcome to our session. And today we will present three three different presentations from uh, different institutions who will be in charge of Artur Gromadzki, um, Christian Halstead, and Armando Quezada. I will start reading their approaches here. One second, please. Here it is. Artur Gromadzki is a researcher in contemporary Japanese philosophy whose work centers on Nishida Kitaro's philosophy, the logic of place, Basho, the active approach, autopoiesis, and the philosophy of life. His PhD research investigates the dynamic interplay between self-organization, embodied experience, and Nishida's predicate and place-oriented metaphysics, with an eye to systematic bridges between Kyoto school thought and contemporary cognitive science. Gromadzki holds an MA in cognitive science from Jagiellonian University and served as a research student in Japanese philosophy at Kyoto University. His current projects include metanoetic transformation and a knowledge of the absolute, how to understand living as negation, and either transformative or rational, not both advancing a dialogue between enactivism, metanoetics, and Nishida's logic of place. He has recently presented at College School, Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology, Directedness and Dependent Co-Origination, and at the IAJP conference in the University of Tokyo, Nishida and the Inactive Approach Toward a Systematic Integration with Varela's Legacy. His publications include Enacted in the Body of Neurophenomenology of Rated First-Person Methodologies in Pragmatics of Experience, which develops first-person methodological resources within neurophenomenology. On our next presentation, we'll have Christian Halstead, who is a PhD candidate in philosophy at Fordham University, New York, where his research focuses on the intersections of contemporary continental philosophy, Japanese philosophy, and metaphysical conceptions of nothingness. Since 2025, he has also served as a special research student at the University of Tokyo, deepening his work on the Kyoto School and speculative approaches to negation and difference. He earned his BA in Philosophy and Religious Studies and Economics from Face University in 2020, graduating with interdisciplinary training that informs his approach to metaphysics, value theory, and the global reception of philosophical traditions. Halstead is the author of Absolute Nothingness, Deleuze, Derrida, and Differential Negativity, an article that examines the conceptual convergences and divergences between continental theories of negation and the Kyoto School articulation of absolute nothingness. He has presented this work at international venues, including his 2025 paper, Nishida Speculative Philosopher, Nothingness, Difference, and the End of Ontotheology, delivered at the International Association for Japanese Philosophy at the University of Tokyo. And finally, we present Dr. Armando Quezada. 1 second. And I will read this in Spanish. Armando Isaac Quezada Medina es un académico y docente con una trayectoria interdisciplinaria que abarca las humanidades, las ciencias exactas y la enseñanza de lenguas clásicas. Es doctor en filosofía por la Universidad de Guanajuato, fue investigador invitado por el Consejo Superior de Investigaciones Científicas, miembro de la Red Iberoamericana Leibniz. Actualmente se desempeña como catedrático en la Universidad de Guanajuato, donde contribuye al desarrollo de competencias académicas. Su labor profesional se caracteriza por una sólida formación en diversas disciplinas, lo que le permite abordar la enseñanza desde una perspectiva integral. Humanidades y Filosofía, especialista en el diseño e impartición de cursos de ética y valores, con un enfoque particular en la filosofía clásica, aristotelismo y estoicismo, aplicada a la formación de estudiantes de nivel medio superior y superior. Lenguas clásicas, docente de griego clásico, dedicado a la preservación y enseñanza de las raíces lingüísticas y culturales de Occidente, ciencias exactas y biológicas. Posee experiencia en la instrucción de temas complejos como la historia de la biología, taxonomía y biotecnología. Okay, so we will start our three presentations. The dynamic will be as following. We will have 20 minutes for each presentation. And at the end of each presentation, we will continue immediately after each with the next presentation. So it'll be 1 hour of 1 hour of time for each presentation. And at the end of that, we will have a space for questions and answers. Questions and answers can either be given here at the chat or on Facebook. So we can start with Artur Gromadzki, please. Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you for very detailed and welcoming. Okay, let me share slides. Okay, I should be okay. Okay, let's start. So, welcome everyone. It's great to be here. Great to present my research. It's kind of shaping out to be something interesting, I would say. So, currently my name is Gromadzki Artur. I'm a PhD student at University of Kyoto. And today I would like to rethink the self-worth relation through Nishida and Francisco Varela. So on the one hand, we will have Nishida and we have Varela. So this will be a comparative work. And the starting point could be that of bifurcation. That is okay. So 1 second. Okay, there we go. Starting point would be that of purification of reality, of mind, matter, the subject, object, inside, outside, self-worth, individual environment. And as I would like to talk about today, there's a very interesting parallel going between Nishida and Varela, who was a pioneer of the enactive approach of the neurophenomenology. So although maybe not Mexican philosophy, at least we have a Spanish language. He was a Chilean person, so we have a Spanish language representation here. So although they emerge from separate traditions, they converge, and for the scope of today's presentation, in overcoming those dualist and substantialist convictions. So neither the self nor the world is a pre-given independent substrate. Instead, there's something like relational ontology, or rather regional ontology, where the identity of self-environment, or rather self and the world, is an important distinction, is a process of constant emergence. So then, if Nishida's world of historical life, of the logic of Basho, shares so much with Varela's logic of autopoietic organization of the living systems, what's left to say, right? This goes to the core question of the comparative philosophy. So why compare? And I think I found my answer, at least fitting my case. So the relation between Nishida and Varela, it could be said in terms of complementarity. So they approach the same paradoxical reality of life, but from a different levels or resolutions. So the topic today would be more of a biology, life forms, where we see for both Varela and Nishida a rejection of mechanisms as well as vitalism in the favor of more dialectical understanding. So the long-term goal would be to analyze this through like broad categories of ontology, epistemology, and logic. But for now, let's say that the difference is all that of resolutions. So what I mean by this is Nishida's philosophy can be characterized by sort of a view from the top, from the side of the world, while for Varela, it's more of a micro scale approach. So Varela's legacy runs a very early work in self-reference, which he connects to self-awareness through developing dialectics for second-order cybernetics, then through the logic of the biological systems, autopoiesis, how the systems create themselves as a definition for life, and then through very influential enaction and the embodied mind. Then sadly passing away in 2001, the unfinished project of neurophonology, connecting the first personal research with third personal research in like this co-defining manner. So, but what reverberates as a kind of base note through Varela's motive of the whole of this whole project is that there's always going back to the concrete, the experiential, the embodied life experience. So, although the traditions of those philosophies, both Nishida and Varela, may be separate, they converge in a certain manner of the overcoming of those so dualist convictions. Oh, and let's say that would be, if I may describe here, yes, those original ontologies. Describe this way of looking for the Nishida sides, the looking from the top. It involves kind of radical shift from the individual subjectivity to a perspective where the world determines itself or through us. And this lets Nishida to dissolve the subject-object split, or the overcoming of the blind spot of science, where we only see the self as the seen one, the noematic aspect, not the one that sees. So essentially, Nishida operates at more. This makes Nishida operate at a more macro scale, so situating life within the historical world and the absolute eternal now. So for Nishida, the world determines itself through individuals who are the creative elements of this historical world. And in this way, he positions the genesis of life as the self-determination of the historical world. And for an individual, like Kobutsu, to be born is to be part of this dialectical world. It is always to be limited, determined, and it's also consequently determination of the life itself. So let me, for now, borrow a few words from the developmental and synthetic biologist Michael Levin. Uh, Most of the big questions of philosophy are raised by the process of embryogenesis. So right in front of our eyes, a single cell, such as a frog egg, multiplies and self-assembles into complex organisms, and with order of every scale of organization and adaptive behavior. And each of us takes the same journey across the Cartesian catechals. So starting off as a quintessent human oocyte, a little blob thought to be well described by chemistry and physics, and gradually undergoes a metamorphosis and eventually becomes a mature human with hopes, dreams, and a self-reflective metacognition that enables one to say that thinks that I'm not a machine, and this is more than a brain, and I'm the body, and there's more than just a molecular mechanism. So how this ties to the Nishida's world or individual? So the inseparability between seeing and making in action intuition is actually related to the dialectic of world's own creativity. So Nishida seems to suggesting that human existence via acting intuition is a kind of microcosmic mirror that resonates with the macrocosmic dialectic. So the historical world is neither the mechanisms of the material world nor theological vitalism of the biological world. And this seems to clarify, for me at least, the notion of mirroring and reflecting, very often found in Nishida. So there's a relation of reflecting the larger whole through the dialectic of this human environment. So, or rather, the dialectic of human environment reflects the larger macrocosmic dialectic. And in a way, we can think of some structural similarity, I would say. And if so, then why also stop at treating individual as the level of the human, which I see Nishida doing often? This brings the question of the status of the individual in Nishida philosophy. Of course, we can make a criticism that Nishida's subject is abstract from Tanabe's social perspective, or the lacks concreteness of the species, or from Tosaka's political Marxist view. So those are all fair points that pertain to very certain domains of our human existence, social, economic, etc. However, here I have a quite different thing in mind. The question is rather point towards the being design of the Dasein, right? Not really what does it mean to be, but what does it mean to become being, if I must a little Heideggerian. So first, let's look at the interesting point in Nishida's philosophy, the well-known historical turn around with the I and O essay and onwards. So there's a very interesting some points that Yamamoto Akira makes about this turn. So it had merits, but also demerits. So the big merits were that Nishida was essentially able to escape from solipsism, connecting the independent I and O through the shared place basho of historical reality. And also there was a discovery of the absolute other. But on the other hand, there was the sacrifice of methodological strictness. So in his earlier work, Nishida was rigid or precise in organizing not only what was actually experienced within his own consciousness, it was more phenomenological. However, by turning to the historical world, he began to describe the logical structure of the world itself, which simply exceeds the limits of a single ego can truly know through one's experience. And this Yamamoto criticizes this in a way that it is kind of absolutization or the God's eye view. which makes actually Nishida's philosophy impossible to correct from the outside. And there's also ambiguity of the first person position. So the specific position and the role of the individual, the I, whether it be Nishida or ourselves engaging with his philosophy, those became unclear. So while Nishida is one philosopher, doesn't mean that he's alone in this endeavor. So some alternative approaches to science, represented by Varela, actually stress those paradoxical aspects, emphasizing the need for those first personal rigidness or strictness. So this goes to the middle early period of Varela, before the big boom of the embodied mind and action. So Varela describes the relationship between the organisms and the self as the imbrication of two separate dialectics that form a single process of co-definition. There is dialectics of identity, which establishes the organisms as an autonomous agent or a for itself mode. So it involves the bootstrapping of two terms, of the dynamical one, like, for example, networks, interactions, or metabolic or neural nets, and the global term. So the emergent totality, like the membranes or the personal self, that kind of downwardly conditions the whole network. And there's the dialectics of knowledge. Once an identity is established, this dialectic describes how the organism specifies its own world. This involves a significance term, the emergence of a surplus of meaning from an organism's perspective, and keep the perspective in mind is very important, and a coupling term, which is the permanent embeddedness and dependence on environmental regularities. And that has consequences for cognition. So the moment identity is defined, a perspective is created. So sort of from the inside, which divides the universe into a system and its world. So this brings here to the key distinction: environment versus the world. So environment is what observer describes, physical chemical regularities we see. But the world is environment as it appears to the system, to one person, individual, single cell. The world exists only in the mutual definition of this identity and activity. And Varela uses the word for itself to describe this moment of living system where it constitutes itself as an entity, distinct from the background. So first, autopoiesis establishes identity, and then does the world stuff. The stuff in the world becomes informed, not information, just informed. It's like more like Nishida's creation formation. So for that unity, in purely physical terms, stuff exists, but it is for nobody. So once a body or autonomous unity is established, environmental perturbations are no longer just physical impacts, they become informed for the self. This is direct consequence for the cognition. When once identity is defined, perspective arises from the inside, which divides this reality into self, this is to the environment, and the world. So it's important to have this sharp distinction. Environment, like the physical laws, chemical laws, are seen by the observer, and the world environment appears to the system itself. So the world only exists in this mutual definition of the system's identity and activity. And here's a useful contrast. So Varela tends to stress how organisms bring forth their worlds, whereas Nishida, from the world side view, reads events as determination of life, self-determination of the historical world itself. Nishida actually has a striking similar also line to Varela, which says that we might say that it is environment that we are placed in, but it is not the world from which we are born. We cannot think of the origin of life as within the environment. And also for Varela, this is like meaningfulness is this distributed process, the link between local processes, the one unity, where there's no central agent, there's no need for any. And importantly, there's no central agent, there's no unifying program, there's no genetic program defining everything, there's no elan vital. It's all from the inside, from the organism. And he has this interesting notion of the surplus of significance. So phrased in other terms, the nature of the environment for cognitive self acquires a curious status. It is that which lends itself to a surplus of significance. So like a jazz improvisation, environment provides the excuse for the neural music from the perspective of cognitive system involved. At the same time, the organisms cannot live without the constant coupling and the constantly emerging regularities. So without the possibility of coupled activity, the system would be a mere solipsistic ghost. And this surplus, what does it mean? Is that For example, raw matter like sucrose is neutral. When for a bacterium, it becomes food, not the other way around. So only in and through its activity, the significance is not extracted but kind of added by the organism's own embodied history as a maintenance of its identity. And inverting the perspective, this continuous sense making is a permanent lack, Varela calls it. So life constantly generates what is not pre-given or already there. So relevance must be produced kind of ex nihilo, distinguishing relevant from irrelevant molecular species, or following one gradient rather than the other, increasing permeability to this ion rather than not the other one. So it entails kind of a mismatch between autonomous system and environment. So in this way, world making begins by a breakdown in autopoiesis, in self-creation. So whether a minor change, like a change in some metabolite concentration, or a major, like disruption of the boundary, each breakdown initiates action on what is missing, so that identity is maintained without implying any teleology. The resulting action appears as an attempt to modify its world, moving towards some nutrients or increasing the metabolic flow, etc. Same for us. I need a water, so I grab a cup. There's always a change, willing for something, doing something. It's all to bring back the stability. So formative action intuition is at the very simplest of being. Yet this activity is very self-contradictory. So it strives to establish with an environment, establish coupling with an environment that itself perturbs the coherence of the system. So while simultaneously demarcating itself from the environment, it brings forth a distinct world. By trying to be one with the environment, we kind of bring forth this world and demarcate ourselves. In Nishida, the environment is what stands in dialogue and negates us. And we face expressive things, always expressive things, of things that are kind of like partial incentives that guide action, never neutral. There's this historical throwness or being bounded, which Nishida links to time and space as this active form. And in this that our immediate world is already form bearing. Things already have the katachi, the form. There's no raw matter. And this aspect resonates with a Buddhist notion of dependence origination. And it's not a coincidence, I believe, because, for example, for Varela and the whole of an active approach, it was very deeply inspired by Buddhism. And also with the inside-outside paradox in this Haldane style kind of active maintenance. For example, Haldane, who Varela was deeply inspired by in the biological thinking, says that inhaling takes in the oxygen from the outside, while exhaling releases carbon dioxide from the inside the body to the external environment. And this simple fact shows that the organisms, for example, the inside and the environment, the outside, are inseparably bound to maintain life. Organisms and environment are inseparable in maintaining this life, its katachi, its form. This is the very contradictory identity at the basic of reality. So consciousness too must be something that already emerges at the depths of the biological life. For Nishida and Varela, negation functions as the source of individuation, establishing identity by differentiating from the background. For Varela, the dialectic of identity is self-separation from background while maintaining this coupling to the environment. So this negation appears as this breakdown I mentioned a second before. There's a permanent lack of something. And the organism asserts itself as a certain whole, yet is contained by environment it organizes. So autonomy of knowledge is possible only via this environmental coupling. For Nishida, then, life is what negates the environment. That we live means that we go on negating the environment. In such a way, the fact that the world of the dialectical universal is continually determining itself, which refers to the historical life that is formatively acting. And for this reason, environmental life, we possess perception in the region of self-negation. Conversely, we possess the will in the region of self-affirmation, that thoroughly affirming oneself. And also in perceiving things, it's not just we receive information from them. We are self-negating, but in willing, acting upon things, we are self-affirming. And that the two are unified in our action intuition. And this self-affirming kind of reminds me of what Varela says about organisms, those fascinating meshworks of selfless selves. no more or no less than open-ended, multi-level, circular existences, always driven by the lack of significance they engender by asserting their presence. And a certain context emerges, that is the lack of external unifier. Ordinarily, Nishida says, we think of the unifier as beyond the unified, but that makes form external, and the system lacks unity in itself. But unifier must be immanent and manifest through beings, the basha of self-determination. However, I think this can be captured actually better by automatic systems, where identity is established by itself, not by external observer, perhaps better capturing. This is what Nishida tries to say. And this then aligns with Varela's node central agent, the meshwork view. So this comes from Varela's 1995 paper, when he makes us look more once again to the concrete, which is not a step, it's just how we arrive and where we stay. So he asks you to imagine walking down the street in a relaxed mood, embodying the readiness at hand of someone who walks walker, and someone simply strolling without a specific goal. And your world is defined by this relaxed state until you reach into your pocket and you realize your wallet is missing. What happens then? At this moment of this is the breakdown where there's a shift in the mood, the readiness to action and perception. The busy street or the greenery of the side road trees suddenly stop being part of your cognitive world. This shows that identity is not one permanent ego, but more of a disunified collection of processes constantly transitioning between those micro-identities with its micro-worlds, each with unique know-how. So we constantly transition between these. From eating lunch to now giving a talk at the conference, we enter new modes of posture, tone, assessment. And the same goes actually for the neurophysiological level. So the brain is not a single designer system, but more of a distributed patchwork of subnetworks, assembled through a history of some tinkering. In that sense, Varela echoes Minsky's Society of Mind, where many local agents operate in specific domains, and mind is the temporary organization of these agents into a larger species. So mind is not a unified thing, or even stable collection of things, but disunified, heterogeneous collection of processes. And what counts as an agent or overall society shifts with the observable level of focus. Let's just think about agency in insect colonies. This sets up Varela's question. So if every cognitive act involves the myriad of contending some processes, how do we understand the moment when one takes the lead and there's something concrete showing up? So in neurodynamics, patterns and oscillations disappear very quickly. What emerges is not just sensory motor output, but the whole readiness to hand, including expectations or emotional tonality that shape the particular micro world. And between those breakdowns, it's like multiple agents, subnetworks compete and cooperate, but only one neuronal assemble becomes prevalent, yielding a behavior and a present moment. So this prevalence is not optimization, but more of a consolidation of those dynamics. And at the cradle of that emergence is largely inaccessible to the lived experience, since we only noticed the micro-identity once it is already present, not while in its gestation. Varela makes some implications for cognitive science, but one is only important for us here. Such micro-worlds are not coherent or integrated into some enormous totality that regulates the veracity of the smaller pieces. It is more like an unruly conversational interaction. It is the very presence of this unruliness that allows for the constitution of a cognitive moment according to the system's constitution and history. The very heart of this autonomy, the fast time of agent's behavioral selection, is forever lost to a cognitive system itself. Thus, what we call traditionally the irrational or the non-conscious is not contradictory to what appears as rational and purposeful, but it's very underpinning. And I think there's some unnothingness of absolute variety creeping under here. And this brings us to the selfless self. Identity is not substance, not even single processual self. It is more like a global coherent pattern that appears virtually as a center, but without a central supervisor. Our organisms as a meshwork of selfless selves. and a set of regional selves at different levels. Indeed, Varela defines a various possible selves. It's a project he left at some point. However, it exemplifies that we have a different, depending on the perspective we take, we can talk about self in different manner. And I think the same also goes for Nishida. These are just some examples and kind of what I'm planning to do. But try to analyze all those possible selves and apparently also the basho, the places, the worlds, the regions to which those selves belong. With the only true self, the being nowhere to be found. It is the seeing without the seer. The self is negated and becomes the operative element of the absolute world, of the absolute nothingness. And as a concluding questions that maybe come up during the talk. Um, what's the aftermath of the historical turn? So was it worth to sacrifice the phonological precision, the rigidity for more enveloping perspective? Or next would be that does Nishida's philosophy really need a biological, the micro scale supplement? Is it worth pursuing? To me, yes, but for there is a blind spot in science, and the need for the non-reductive, non-dualist philosophical approaches like kind of emerges right now. And the last question would be something I wasn't able to fit in the frame of the presentation, and that would be what takes priority in our thinking: reproduction, production, or identity? It is a chicken and egg dilemma, but Nishida seems to be the former. For we are always first created within the world and then create from the created to the maker. So for Vela, it seems to be the latter, that reproduction has historical precedence and identity over identity, but identity has logical and ontological priority. And that will be it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Artur. That was an excellent presentation over several topics that we will be following after our next two presentations, according to the questions that that people can write on the chat or on Facebook, where we are also transmitting this presentation. Thank you so much, Artur. This was the self-negation, selfless self. Now we will go to the next presentation by Christian Halstead from Fordham University, which is about Nishida's dialectical realism, an encounter with Hegel. Thank you, Christian. The same dynamic, 20 minutes, maximum 25. And thank you so much.
Yeah. If I could share my screen.
Yeah, of course. I think it's already possible. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Okay, perfect. Cool. Awesome. Thank you guys for having me, and thank you, Artur, for very, very interesting. There's a lot to say there. So, okay, I'm just going to get into it. I've just provided my essay on the screen here. I think it's easier to just follow along like this. So, let's get into it. Okay, my presentation is called Nishida Kitaro's Dialectical Realism, an Encounter with Hegel. The following presentation aims to present the findings of my broader research project, drawing from Nishida's critique of Hegel, specifically his 1931 essay, Hegel's Dialectic as Seen from My Standpoint. In that pivotal essay, Nishida distinguishes himself from Hegel in the context of their proximity. In particular, Nishida secures the validity of his methodological commitment to experience, or noesis, which he contrasts with Hegel's alleged focus on conceptual objects, or noema. Despite dialectical nuance to the contrary, Nishida argues that noesis provides for a more thoroughly presuppositionalist beginning of philosophy and refines contradiction beyond Hegel's fidelity to noema. The details of this analysis, however, exceed the space of the current presentation, though I'd be happy to elaborate during the Q&A. For now, I'd like to present in still argumentative, rather than purely descriptive fashion, Nishida's constructive alternative as I've systematized it, which becomes clear in light of his critique of Hegel's absolute idealism. Nishida's mid to late philosophy of absolute nothingness may be best understood as a post-Kantian dialectical realism, which overcomes the opposition between dialectics and realism by re-envisioning both standpoints beyond traditional formulations. So what follows, I'm going to be elaborating that more or less autonomously, though like I said, this is within the context of a broader project focusing on their relation. So go into it. Following its publication Professor Soto Kiichiro criticized Nishida's landmark 1926 essay Basho. The logic of Basho, Soto alleges, oversteps the boundary of reason. Instead of restricting its claims to what can be given within subjectivity, this framework makes direct truth claims about the world in itself. This extends beyond what Kant's critical epistemology deems knowable. Soda concludes, Nishida naively overlooks cognitive mediation and so falls back into what Kant will call a pre-critical dogmatic metaphysics. In a reply to Dr. Soda in 1927, Nishida responds that the Basho system does not retreat from, but instead radicalizes Kantian critique. Whereas Kant's critical philosophy asks how experience is possible, the Basho system asks how the critical project itself is possible. Ultimately, it excavates still further transcendental strata, conditioning the subjective apparatus tout court. Nishida discovers true reality not as a metaphysical object out there, but rather as the broader a priori field within which subjectivity is situated. Before delineating the logic of Basho, we first need to review Kantian critique and then Nishida's proposed move beyond it. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant conducts a transcendental mode of analysis, which asks, given X, what must first be logically true in order for X to occur? Specifically, Kant seeks the transcendental conditions of possible experience, which determine how the world must appear to us in order for it to be perceived at all. These transcendental conditions are a priori, insofar as the mental scaffolding that mediates experience necessarily precedes any particular mentation. Kant discovers that the mind consists of distinct transcendental operations or faculties whose respective a priori conditions converge to produce actual experience. For example, the faculty of sensibility channels sensory experience through its a priori forms of intuition, time and space. Likewise, the understanding determines the world's conceptualization under the categories of quantity, quality, relation, and modality. Kant concludes, we only ever perceive things as they appear to us within the mediating framework of subjectivity, never how they truly exist in themselves. This limitation yields Kant's distinction between the phenomenal and noumenal. The phenomenal refers to the world of empirical experience, accessible to cognition within transcendental parameters. The noumenal articulates the impossibility of knowledge regarding things in themselves, outside the boundaries of possible experience. What Kant refers to as metaphysics emerges when one overlooks this distinction and instead mistakenly attributes ontological truth to subjective cognition. By describing reality using phenomenal categories, metaphysics inevitably projects subjective perceptions onto noumena that may in fact bear no resemblance thereto. Nishida affirms Kant's critique of metaphysics while discussing true reality. This qualification demonstrates that Nishida seeks to ascertain what may be provisionally termed noumena outside of subjective representation. But how is this possible, given Kant's prohibition on knowing things in themselves? Nishida proposes to regain access to true reality by overcoming the distinction between subject and object from a standpoint of non-dual epistemic unity with the world. Contra Kant, we are not cut off from the absolute, but united with it, and so can accurately relay speculative truth. For Nishida, the division between self and world is not metaphysically primary. Instead, it emerges through categorization, which treads upon a more fundamental substratum, experience as such. Before divining the subject-object split, there is simply awareness, not as my possession, but as a matter of fact. Consciousness, in its sheer emergence, constitutes a natural occurrence, so to speak, not a representational apparatus. In its immediate unfolding, then, awareness arises from a broader field than the individual mind, which is only defined thereafter. Prior to the self-world divide, experience is not a private phenomena, but directly real, and so proves capable of disclosing truths exceeding internalized selfhood. Nishida analyzes the ontological import of experience using Edmund Husserl's distinction between noesis and noema. Noesis means the subjective act of experiential intentionality. This can take the form of thinking, perceiving, imagining, and so on. By contrast, noema refer to the corollary objects, the contents or meanings, intended in and by that consciousness. Nishida distinguishes these elements, breaking with Husserl's insistence upon their co-equal footing. While noema do disclose a certain truth, their intended nature invites the misguided metaphysical tendency to project subjective objectifications outward. So instead, Nishida argues, noesis must serve as the channel through which the world's broader ontological field manifests itself in experience. What is true about consciousness is that I am really awake, as opposed to any representational residuum derived from this more basic function. In contrast to noema, which objectify the world metaphysically, noesis articulates the active processes that constitute awareness as a function of reality itself. At the level of pure noesis, experience reveals its indistinction from the broader world of which it is a part. In Nishida's Basho, then, Nishida's mission becomes to distill the inner truth of noesis, since this unveils a register so fundamental it surpasses what can be considered merely subjective and instead reveals a truth common to all things. In search of true reality, Nishida does not look outward towards metaphysical noema. Instead, he inwardly examines noesis through an analysis of transcendental priority, which mirrors yet ultimately surpasses Kant. Nishida delineates a series of increasingly prior transcendental strata called basho, meaning place, intended to grasp noesis at the deepest level of interiority. Each basho carries its own distinct perspective on objectivity in general, contextualizing a corresponding mode of content, whether empirical objectivity, transcendental subjectivity, volitional activity, or finally absolute nothingness. The relation between basho is subsumptive. Each is contained in, determined by, and reduced to the one that follows. This progression increasingly approximates the truth of noesis and, by extension, the absolute as its final terminus. Nishida's organization of basho is decidedly post-Kantian. This logic moves ever backward toward an increasingly prior mode of transcendental conditioning. In doing so, it passes through transcendental subjectivity to articulate true reality on the other, or really near, side of cognitive mediation. The first basho of judgment corresponds to the empirical world, while the second basho of self-consciousness encapsulates transcendental subjectivity. Between these basho, Nishida insists he is, quote, consistently retaining Kant's standpoint insofar as the mind acts as the formative transcendental context within which the natural world unfolds. Yet, Nishida then departs from Kant by working further backward. With the third basho of volition, Nishida uncovers an underlying a priori will, which enlivens the syntheses of transcendental consciousness themselves. Still prior to that, the final basho of absolute nothingness acts as the innermost transcendental container within which all subsequent phenomena unfold. Kant would criticize Nishida's last two basho of volition and nothingness as unknowable, since they precede and so exceed subjectivity. However, Nishida's epistemology of pure noesis ensures access to sub-representational strata from the standpoint of self-world unity. Thus, the basho system delimits while overtaking phenomenal subjectivity by revealing additional noumenal a priori conditions, further enveloping Kant's own apparatus. At the deepest level, awareness internally discloses a presubjective universal common to all things, namely the utterly prior noetic field of absolute nothingness. Nishida discovers absolute nothingness as the empty expanse within which prior basho are situated at the extreme outer limit of transcendental inclusion. The basho of volition is enveloped albeit in the sense of floating in nothingness. Having established this final a priori, Nishida's question becomes directly analytical. What is nothingness? He argues absolute nothingness, being absolutely nothing, cannot be a simple unity. Were nothingness some self-consistent identity, it would be an identifiable thing endowed with coherent positive features. Yet this would incorrectly make nothingness something, such as empty space or infinite blackness. Nothingness can only become absolutely nothing, then, by negating itself within itself, a structure Nishida refers to as its, quote, absolutely contradictory self-identity. The self-contradictory rather than self-unified nature of absolute nothingness distinguishes it from any noematic ontological identity. Instead, absolute nothingness maintains its radical inexistence as Osaki Harumi confirms, quote, through the negation of itself as the most fundamental negation, end quote. So far, we have established that Nishida provides a post-Kantian vision of the absolute. True reality is not a metaphysical object out there, but rather the transcendental basho of contradictory nothingness conditioning subjectivity itself. At this stage in our analysis, however, the status of Nishida's position remains underdetermined. Nishida locates true reality from within rather than without. This may initially invite interpretations such as idealism or even panpsychism. However, two features of the Basho system complicate such an approach. First, reduction, and second, syllogism. In the first case, each basho is ontologically reduced to the one that follows. For example, the basho of judgment does not retain sovereignty from self-consciousness as a separate domain. Instead, what was previously mistaken for an autonomous world of physically real objects comes to be seen more accurately as a subjective phenomena conditioned by the mind. Continually, the basho system reshapes the composition of its content through a movement that collapses successive strata down or backwards, with each supplanting the last. In the end, ultimately, all of being manifests absolutely nothing. Quote, even acts disappear. We can no longer find anything anywhere like a substance, end quote. This structure becomes particularly informative in conjunction with, in the second case, the syllogistic relation between basho. Nishida repeatedly articulates basho syllogistically, which with each containing more than the last. For example, whereas the basho of judgment contains empirical perception, the basho of self-consciousness contains the basho of judgment in addition to the transcendental faculties. From there, quote, in the syllogism, we already see a transition from the standpoint of judgment to the standpoint of will, transcending so-called universal conceptual determination, end quote. If self-consciousness contains more than judgment, then by extension, volition contains more than just transcendental subjectivity. Here, Nishida begins to identify a domain irreducible to the mind, outside the boundaries of epistemic mediation. This process continues on through absolute nothingness, which contains even more than the will. From the standpoint of self-world unity, Nishida has unveiled strata surpassing cognition itself. By combining reduction with syllogism, Nishida attributes subjectivity to a broader transcendental register which equally extends beyond it. The world does not exist as a noematic object out there, since subjectivity emerges as an immanent expression of absolute nothingness. We are a part of the world, not apart from it. Nevertheless, subjectivity does not exhaust this noetic field either. Rather, Nishida ontologically identifies subjectivity with what exceeds it. Here we can begin to discern in Nishida a certain realism, defined as the avowal of an extramental reality which does not depend upon phenomenological manifestation. Robert J.J. Wargo, Yuko Ishihara, and even Nishitani Keiji all characterize Nishida's philosophy as a modified form of realism. However, to secure this position, we must address his potentially confounding identification of reality with experience. Quote, the actually existing world is the world of experience, the thing in itself, end quote. Based on his stated constraints, we can deduce that Nishida desubjectifies experience by extending it beyond mere empirical sensibility. Nishida rejects naive realism's metaphysical objectification of an external world. At the same time, he also rejects idealism. Yet, how can experience be ontological without lapsing into idealism? One might identify phenomena one to one with the world as such, and so discard the label mind. But this is inconsistent with Nishida's criticism of Husserl as, quote, simply a phenomenology of the world of consciousness. End quote. When Nishida says experience, he must mean something irreducible to the apparatus through which human beings, however reconceived, see the world. Instead, experience refers to the internal self-reflection of absolute nothingness in itself, owed to its contradictory self-identity. Nothingness recursively reflects itself within itself by one, negating itself, and then two, interiorizing that negation, three, as the structure of its own non-being. Nishida's realism regards the all-encompassing noetic field of absolute nothingness, which is intrinsically experiential, that is, self-manifesting and self-expressive, on account of its self-reflexive inner negativity. For Nishida, dialectics follows from the recursive contradiction of absolute nothingness. Dialectical negativity designates a two-sided negation. X negates Y, while Y negates X. Neither of these elements pre-exist their reciprocal negation. Instead, both X and Y are constituted through their contrast, each emerging as the negation of the other. Retaining this structure, absolute nothingness self-negates to form various internal boundaries, limitations, and contours. These internal divides circumscribe the determinate negation of entities constituted therein. The self-contradiction of nothingness thus gives rise to objects as its own intrinsic negative self-determinations. Engendered by absolutely nothing, things are themselves defined through reciprocal negation in their oppositional contrast amongst one another. Absolute nothingness successively negates each and every one of its consecutive configurations insofar as it is inherently incapable of ossifying into a flat noematic object. By negating itself and then negating the results of that negation repeatedly, absolute nothingness self-determines itself into the dialectical world of everyday life, transpiring across a series of ongoing negations. Taken together, Nishida's later philosophy uniquely combines realism with dialectics. Nishida cautions against naive metaphysical realism, which regards the world as a supramental object. We are one with reality, but not because the world is an effect of the mind. Instead, Nishida reductively identifies subjectivity with the deeper, broader basho of absolute nothingness, which remains irreducible to its epistemic disclosure. The site of experience, absolute nothingness, exceeds what we call human, and yet it remains contradictory and so dialectical in itself. Here, Nishida breaks with the traditional opposition between realism and dialectics. Typically, realists portray the mind-independent universe as fully constituted, positively in itself. Conversely, dialecticians conventionally tether the world's transformative negation to a particular mode of subjectivity, such as Hegel's absolute knowledge or Marx's labor. Nishida confounds the association of realism with positivism, however, by contrastively situating absolute nothingness prior to self-consciousness while maintaining its inherent contradiction. If absolute nothingness negates itself within itself prior to self-consciousness, then dialectical constitution occurs apart from the intervention of any conceptually mediated subjective interiority. Thus, the process of negation that dialecticians typically reserve for subjecthood features instead as an intrinsic feature of absolute nothingness in itself. With or without us, Nishida assures, quote, the world determines itself, end quote. In sum, Nishida is a post-Kantian realist about a contradictory nothingness that dialectically self-determines itself apart from subjectivity. I've said this position becomes clear from 1931 onward as Nishida shifts from his critique of Hegel to formulating his own constructive alternative. Nishida is neither an absolute idealist, Hegel, nor a dialectical materialist, Marx. Whereas Hegel's absolute spirit culminates in the conceptual self-relation historically realized in sentience, Marx's matter remains a metaphysical noema. Nishida's nothingness, by contrast, however shadowy, far from being abstract, concretely reconfigures the historical world. Grappling with actuality means to engage with absolute nothingness. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian. Thank you. So this was Nishida's Dialectical Realism, an encounter with Hegel. Same dynamic, the questions will come at the end of the sessions. Our next presenter will be Dr. Armando Quezada Medina from the Universidad de Guanajuato. Y el título será, the title will be La conciencia del ego en Toshihiko Izutsu. Muchas gracias.
¿Qué tal? Buenas tardes. Voy a iniciar compartiendo la pantalla. Bueno, en primer lugar, first place, I offer my apologies for not having prepared this presentation in English. It's not due to a lack of courtesy toward our international guest, but rather a result of time constraints. In the near future, I will share a more complete version of this presentation in both language, Spanish and English. Muy bien, bueno, pues voy a comenzar. Voy a presentar básicamente un análisis, ¿no? de lo que es la interpretación del profesor Toshihiko Izutsu acerca del budismo. Entonces, lo primero que voy a realizar es una presentación muy breve del budismo, porque a mí lo que me interesa es la interpretación del profesor Izutsu, especialmente desde la versión clásica japonesa, que es la versión de Dogen. Entonces voy a iniciar por ahí. Posteriormente veré la interpretación de Izutsu en un texto que él publica en Estados Unidos y que escribe en inglés, posteriormente se traduce al castellano. Y finalmente voy a cerrar con algunas ideas de comparación, por un lado, y de reflexión acerca de los tipos de pensamiento, para no llamarles todavía filosóficos, ¿verdad?, que se han dado en las tierras niponas, por un lado, y por otro, lo que se ha hecho en Occidente relacionado con estos temas, no de manera exhaustiva, sino simplemente de manera reflexiva y comparativa. Entonces voy a comenzar en primer lugar con la premisa del trabajo. Esta premisa, pues vamos a comenzarla con una pequeña referencia, ¿no?, a lo que es el budismo, y lo voy a hacer de la siguiente manera, ¿no? Bueno, el budismo, como se sabe, el budismo zen en específico, es un conjunto de manifestaciones que se han dado desde varios lugares, desde varios autores y desde muchas épocas. Por lo tanto, es un movimiento sincrético que tiene pues una estructura que se puede pues conocer, no de manera sistemática necesariamente, porque lo primero con lo que inicia el profesor Izutsu es precisamente mencionando que de alguna manera habría que considerar el budismo zen incluso como una antifilosofía. De ahí que su tarea, y pues en parte también la de todos los que podamos tratar de hacer un análisis filosófico de esta tradición, pareciese en algún sentido contradictoria, pero bueno, habrá que defender la parte filosófica precisamente de este análisis, ¿no? Y aquí me voy a centrar específicamente en la última parte, si bien es cierto que hay que analizar también algunos aspectos especialmente lingüísticos de las otras estructuras sincréticas como son el lenguaje indio, el lenguaje chino, el sánscrito, el chino y el japonés, ¿no? Entonces, a pesar de que solamente me voy a basar en Dogen, bueno, pues hay varios conceptos que fueron transmitiéndose en todas estas escuelas. El objetivo, pues, es mostrar al final ciertas discrepancias y afinidades, ¿no?, entre el tipo del pensamiento zen y la filosofía. Entonces, voy a comenzar en primer lugar con el budismo zen. Aquí les pongo una frase, ¿no?, una serie de preguntas que podríamos considerar ya un primer koan. Los koanes dentro de la tradición del zen tienen una intención. La intención es generar vacilación en el pensamiento. Más adelante voy a aclarar esta parte, ¿no? Vacilación en el pensamiento, ¿por qué? Porque estamos acostumbrados a interpretar y conocer las cosas de una manera que, como en Occidente, pues, digamos, es más sencillo expresarlo. En Occidente se conoce pues como una forma de relación entre sujeto y objeto, ¿no? Una clásica estructura epistemológica y nociológica entre nuestra conciencia y aquello que conoce nuestra conciencia, específicamente pues algo a lo que solemos considerar como un objeto, ahorita sin meternos en detalles más complejos. Entonces este primer koan nos dice lo siguiente: ¿en qué piensas?, le está preguntando un monje al maestro zen, mientras estás ahí sentado sin pensar. Esta idea del estar sentado, ¿no?, sin pensar es lo que se suele conocer como zazen, que es la meditación que se realiza precisamente por los budistas. Y él le contesta: pienso en el no pensar. Y el monje pregunta: ¿cómo se piensa en el no pensar? Y el maestro responde: precisamente sin pensar. Para poder, ¿no?, comprender un poco lo que está aquí en juego, quizá antes de hacer una reflexión como se suele hacer en Occidente, en una reflexión profunda sobre el significado de cada una de las palabras y la reflexión que implica, convendría más bien empezar a manifestar un alejamiento precisamente de esas cuestiones teóricas, de esas cuestiones que solemos vincular con la tradición filosófica y que inmediatamente nos muestran a nosotros un panorama sobre una metaestructura, tanto del lenguaje como de la realidad, ¿no? En el caso del Zen, lo primero que hay que realizar pues es lo contrario, ¿no? Darnos cuenta del momento, acercarnos a ese preciso momento y tratar de conocerlo de manera lo más inmediata posible, sin agregarle, ¿no?, condiciones teóricas como solemos hacer en Occidente. Entonces, ese es el primer momento. ¿Por qué? Porque para Dogen, el hecho mismo de llevar a cabo el zazen, de llevar a cabo entonces esta meditación sentado, lo que quiere decir es que pues ahora sí nosotros ya estamos entrando en el terreno de lo que se suele conocer como la iluminación, el satori, nombrado por los japoneses. La cuestión es esta, que muchas tradiciones, lo podemos nosotros comprender en tradiciones occidentales místicas, lo podemos también conocer en otro tipo de manifestaciones de carácter pues esotérico, ¿no?, místicas, relacionado con lo místico, con la cábala, por ejemplo, en los judíos, relacionado también, por ejemplo, con el sufismo islámico. Y lo que tenemos que hacer es hacer como un tipo de iniciación. En el caso de Dogen no se da la circunstancia de la misma manera, sino que Dogen dice básicamente nosotros al hacer ya un primer acercamiento al Zazen, lo que nosotros estamos logrando es entrar a la iluminación. Es el medio, es el fin también que nosotros estamos buscando, ¿no? Claro que no es un fin como en otros sistemas, como en otras filosofías o como en otras meditaciones, sino que en este fin de lo que se trata es de llegar a la nulidad, lo cual también habré de explicar en la siguiente diapositiva porque no me voy a tardar tanto en esta parte. Bueno, una vez que tenemos este primer inicio, ¿no? que debe ser un ejercicio muchas veces en la filosofía, en los estudios sobre el pensamiento y teóricos, nos olvidamos de que estos autores escriben para que nosotros lo hagamos, no para tanto estar reflexionando sobre los conceptos, ¿no? Lo mismo pasa con el idealismo, lo mismo pasa con el neoplatonismo, lo mismo pasa con un montón de teorías, y a veces nos concentramos más en tratar de sacar el significado, el simbolismo, etcétera, detrás de todo esto sin aplicarlo, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, aquí sería conveniente como ir siguiendo un poquito el ejercicio que nos va proponiendo Dogen para tratar de entender mejor también lo que significa precisamente hacer el Zen. Entonces, para Dogen, ¿no? Nosotros comenzamos percibiendo y analizando una realidad que pues es prácticamente una ilusión. Para tratar de abandonar esa ilusión, lo primero que tenemos que hacer es esta postura, ¿no? Porque además la postura es muy importante del zazen, que es la meditación de estar sentado también. Posteriormente se da el koan. Aquí digo posteriormente en un sentido meramente, pues de que no puedo decir todo al mismo tiempo, ¿verdad? Meramente, pues ahora sí que temporal, tal y como lo voy mencionando. Sin embargo, como habíamos dicho, el zazen mismo ya es el inicio de la iluminación. El koan es la reflexión que nos hace entonces a nosotros poner en tela de juicio esa condición que posteriormente Izutsu va a llamar la condición de la identidad, que encontramos, por ejemplo, mucho en el pensamiento occidental, y hay que tratar de desvincularnos de ella a través precisamente de este tipo de enigmas que van apareciendo. Posteriormente nos damos cuenta del Dharma, ese Dharma que a veces nos comienza a parecer como una naturaleza de lo real, ya no la ilusión que vemos con nuestras percepciones y que separa siempre el cuerpo de la mente o que separa el objeto de la conciencia, sino que ahora lo empezamos a ver diferente, pero lo empezamos a ver en un momento específico, que es el uji, un término ya de carácter japonés. Dharma es sánscrito, y en el uji, que es algo que se podría traducir como momento existencial, es donde nosotros podemos analizar, por ejemplo, analizar aquí en un sentido muy amplio del término, donde podemos nosotros percibir, donde podemos también dejar de percibir qué es aquello que nosotros estamos conociendo realmente, ¿no? Y es donde se empieza a romper entonces nuestra base y nuestra forma de juicios tradicionales, en donde siempre vemos esa separación, para llegar a la talidad, que por un lado es la nulidad, este término, tathata, del sánscrito, que por un lado representa la nulidad no es la nada absoluta, ¿no? Por lo menos tal y como lo vamos a exponer aquí, no es la nada en la que deja de existir el todo, sino en donde no hay mente. Por eso es que esa talidad también se puede interpretar como la mismidad. Y finalmente el Satori. Todo esto, ¿no? Dentro de ese momento de reflexión, de conocimiento y de ruptura, también ciertamente con la conciencia empírica. Ahora, Izutsu, ¿cómo interpreta esto? En primer lugar, Izutsu nos va a decir que hay que romper la imagen de Occidente, porque bueno, claramente Izutsu lo que hacía pues era presentar la filosofía también acá del otro lado del mundo. Entonces tenía en primer lugar que pues sacarnos, ¿no? Como de esa burbuja en la que nos encontramos, en una interpretación bastante tradicionalista de la epistemología, aunque bueno, aquí también voy a defender la otra postura, que no todas las ideas filosóficas entran dentro de ese terreno, como parece señalar Izutsu, sino que hay muchas vertientes más en las cuales incluso algunas pues son similares en algún punto, en varios a la doctrina del budismo, y que ciertamente se clasifican como filosofía, pero por la manera en que nosotros las hemos interpretado. Pero bueno, en el caso de Izutsu nos dice que en primer lugar hay que romper entonces esta idea o imagen de Occidente creada del hombre, creada del humano, hacerlo pedazos, esa imagen. Específicamente el hecho de que se suele considerar como un animal racional, que sabemos que es una definición atribuida a Aristóteles, aunque bueno, en realidad Aristóteles nunca la dijo, se encuentra en Alejandro de Afrodisias y de ahí se empezó a compartir por toda la tradición latina y toda la que llega hasta el escolasticismo y posteriormente toda la tradición europea. El punto entonces es hacer una división entre esa conciencia que se tiene o que se suele tener en Occidente, que es, digamos, la más tradicional, por otra, que es precisamente la de alcanzar la yoidad absoluta, como le llama Izutsu, diciendo que en el Zen hay que alcanzar la yoidad absoluta, que es la real e inmediata eseidad. Bueno, aquí yo no quise modificar para nada los términos que usa Izutsu, especialmente en el hecho de este último término de eseidad, porque pues uno de los problemas principales que tiene el Zen es precisamente romper lo que significa la esencia, ¿no? Porque nosotros cuando conocemos las cosas, las conocemos o intentamos conocerlas dentro de la identidad, dentro entonces de esta idea de que por lo menos dentro de nuestro conocimiento no cambian, de que son absolutas ahí, hasta eternas, casi aplicando, ¿no? Esta idea de subespecie eternitatis, conocer bajo la especie de la eternidad, prácticamente todas las cosas, ¿no? Y parece ser que es una cierta tendencia en muchos sistemas filosóficos occidentales. Dicen, no, hay que romper completamente eso, la esencia eterna, la esencia duradera de las cosas, porque ese es el camino que no sigue el Zen, que hay que destruir para poder avanzar en él. Entonces, a partir de ahí, se hace una distinción entre las conciencias. La primera, llamada vikalpa, que es un término del sánscrito, es una conciencia empírica que nos lanza a nosotros hacia lo que sería el principio de identidad. Bueno, ¿qué quiere decir esto? La conciencia empírica, que también es nombrada como conciencia cotidiana, nos ofrece diversos puntos de vista sobre una misma cosa, ¿no? El ejemplo quizá más clásico que aparezca en los textos, por ejemplo, de Dogen y de algunos otros budistas, es la cuestión del color. Muchas veces, y esto me pasó hace poco en una clase, ¿no? Hace 2 días en una clase con mis alumnos de bachillerato, estábamos hablando precisamente sobre la cuestión de los colores, ¿no? Y decíamos, bueno, realmente es objetivo un color. Estábamos tratando el tema de lo bueno en la ética de Moore y es el ejemplo que pone precisamente el de los colores para indicar que no podemos dar una definición de él, sin embargo tenemos una intuición inmediata. Y bueno, ¿no? Me preguntaron, bueno, profe, pero ¿de qué color es su camisa? ¿No? Yo les decía, pues es azul. Y se quedaron así como riéndose, ¿no? Pensando que era una broma. Bueno, yo soy daltónico. No para todos el color es el mismo. Y precisamente a esto se refiere la idea de que en el mundo real las esencias para nosotros pueden ser incluso diferentes para una misma persona, pero no, digamos, no dudamos de que eso que se nos aparece sea realmente así. En cambio, en la conciencia Zen, como hemos dicho, lo que tenemos que hacer, en primer lugar, es tratar de comprender que quizá esa validez, ¿no? de las cosas tal y como se nos presentan, en realidad es falsa, es ilusoria. Por lo tanto, hay una cierta imposibilidad de que se presente el principio de identidad. Entonces, habría que partir desde ese punto. Una vez que se parte desde ese punto y nos vamos dando cuenta de que es posible otro tipo de reflexión, otro tipo de conciencia, aparece precisamente la conciencia Zen, ¿no? Ideada, como ahora lo digo, por estos autores, por estos monjes, por estos maestros, a partir de la idea de la meditación, que nos lleva a el conocimiento del prajna. Y aquí les pongo esta fórmula utilizada muy comúnmente por los budistas, ¿no? En sánscrito, que nos dice lo siguiente: Sabedharma anatta. Básicamente es la idea, ¿no? De que todas, ¿no? Todas las cosas se dan sin un yo. También se suele traducir como se dan sin una esencia, lo cual sería, pues, por lo menos en un cierto principio, interesante y contradictorio, porque parecería que nos está diciendo cómo vamos a tener conciencia de cosas sin una conciencia, ¿no? Rompe el principio, por ejemplo, del idealismo inmediatamente. Sin un yo, ¿cómo existen las cosas? Entonces, podríamos decir de manera muy sencilla, si esto lo conceptualizáramos desde nuestra trinchera, decir que este tipo de pensamiento pues es un realismo, ¿no? Un realismo ingenuo, un realismo absoluto. Sin embargo, no se están refiriendo a eso. Entonces, ¿a qué se refiere? ¿No? ¿A qué se refiere, dice Izutsu, con esto? Y nos presenta el siguiente esquema. Dice, el esquema tradicional con el que nosotros trabajamos, en primer lugar, pues es el de que tenemos conciencia de algo, y esto aparece pues en muchos sistemas filosóficos. De ahí que podamos hacer distinciones también, por ejemplo, cuando tenemos un conocimiento de tipo inconsciente o cuando tenemos a conciencia, ¿no? No tenemos conciencia. Y nos dice él, para no confundirnos con términos tradicionales, vamos a utilizar otro término, que es el de la supraconciencia. Para alcanzar esa supraconciencia, nosotros lo que necesitamos hacer es explicar de manera adecuada la esfera del sujeto, la esfera en donde se mueve su propia conciencia, no desde el mundo empírico, sino a partir precisamente desde la doctrina Zen. Porque en el mundo empírico, dice él, lo que tenemos son dos pasos, básicamente, o dos estados de la forma mundana de conocimiento. En primer lugar, esa primera estructura estaría basada en la dicotomía cartesiana de la res cogitans y la res extensa. El hombre ahí se mantiene como un espectador del mundo. Un segundo estado, dice él, sería el del ser en el mundo de Heidegger. El hombre como parte de la función, como parte del espectáculo, en donde sufre una angustia existencial. Dice que quizá Heidegger se parezca un poco más al Zen, sin embargo, no están cerca ninguna de estas dos estructuras de expresar la estructura, ¿no? Porque en esta estructura lo que tenemos es una conexión entre sujeto y objeto, una S ligada con una flecha a una O, y esa es básicamente la idea que tenemos de epistemología. Yo veo esto, dice Izutsu en su obra sobre el budismo zen. Yo veo esto escrito en minúsculas para distinguirlo de la conciencia zen. Ahí, en la S, tenemos la conciencia del ego. Y dice, cuando nosotros trascendemos esta forma de conocimiento, a través de estos pasos que ya hemos mostrado, ¿no? A través de la reflexión, a través de la meditación, obtenemos otro modelo, otra estructura, que es precisamente la que tengo aquí dibujada en la diapositiva, en donde S en mayúscula, que es yo veo en mayúscula, yo veo, está dirigida hacia un objeto, pero ahí lo que quiere decir es que ese yo veo, esa conciencia, ¿no? Ya se ha dado cuenta de ella, pero no solo eso, no solo como en el idealismo, sino que además esa conciencia, ¿no? Se sabe como parte de algo más, como algo más complejo, no nada más como una, digamos, mera oposición al objeto. Por eso cuando se ve al objeto, el objeto se tiene que ver también en relación a esa S. Entonces podemos nosotros como distinguir estos dos momentos, y una vez que hemos distinguido esos dos momentos, podemos ahora sí asumir el principio. Dice él que hay que tener cuidado con esta palabra de principio fundamento, pero aún así las utiliza Izutsu, sobre las dos partes que nosotros hemos separado. Y eso que tienen en común es el sujeto en mayúscula con su flecha, que quiere decir yo veo. Y dice, finalmente es simplemente el ver. ¿Y qué significa simplemente el yo veo ver en mayúscula? Significa entonces darnos cuenta de la nulidad a la que hemos llegado, en donde objeto y sujeto son una misma cosa. Si nosotros nos regresamos un poco, ¿no?, a la palabra que habíamos analizado antes sobre el uji, el momento existencial, ahí es donde nosotros nos damos cuenta de esa unidad, de esa unión, en donde tendríamos que, mientras la conciencia empírica nos dice que una manzana es una manzana y se respeta el principio de identidad, en cambio, en el modelo de la conciencia zen, la manzana no es la manzana. ¿Por qué? Porque todas esas estructuras y condiciones, lo que nosotros llamaríamos accidentes, características de la manzana, que nosotros la percibimos así, en realidad en ese momento de la reflexión han desaparecido como tal. No se presentan en esa inmediatez. de la conciencia empírica, sino que se presentan en esta nueva esfera del sujeto, del puro ver, en donde se llega precisamente también a la mismidad. El pensar se convierte en ese sentido en un no pensar, porque se elimina la estructura de base, la estructura de fondo de la conciencia empírica, para dar paso a esta nueva. Bueno, básicamente esta es la idea fundamental y termino con lo siguiente de este apartado para finalizar más bien con preguntas más que con resultados. Lo que hace Izutsu es decir que mientras la mayoría de sistemas o posiciones filosóficas occidentales están basadas en un substancialismo que conduce inevitablemente a un esencialismo, aquí pone de ejemplos a Platón y Aristóteles. Yo no estoy tan de acuerdo con eso en todos los casos, pero bueno, yo lo voy a mantener aquí. El budismo en realidad, en lo que se fija, no es en esa substanciación o esencialización de los fenómenos, sino en la relación que guardan unos con otros. Entonces, de ahí que nosotros podamos establecer, ¿no?, una distinción entre la conciencia 100 y algunas propuestas filosóficas. Aquí pongo algunas, ¿no? Por cuestión de tiempo, pues no podemos meternos a cada una de ellas, ¿verdad? Pero me gustaría señalar especialmente, para no meternos en cada una, ciertas cuestiones que parecen interesantes, especialmente no en el sentido, digamos, disruptivo, que eso lo va mencionando Izutsu en cada momento y yo ya he hecho mención de ello también, sino más bien aquellas en las que puede tener alguna cierta, un cierto acercamiento, una cierta concomitancia, como sería, por ejemplo, el neoplatonismo, en donde la mente, ¿no?, la inteligencia es una con el ser desde el punto de vista absoluto. La segunda énada que aparece, por ejemplo, en Plotino, pues es básicamente esa doctrina de la unidad entre intelecto y cosa, y objeto, y ser. La comunión de las almas, por supuesto, que aparece también en algunos textos y que trabaja Izutsu desde el punto de vista del budismo. Y por otro lado, Schopenhauer, que Schopenhauer, como sabemos, pues tenía un conocimiento de las doctrinas de la India y que podría tener, por ejemplo, allí alguna semejanza pues con la parte de la voluntad. Como mi objetivo era presentar más las ideas, ¿no?, de Izutsu que otra cosa, bueno, voy a terminar mi ponencia con esto. En un trabajo más amplio presentaré todas estas relaciones, ¿no?, con estos autores y sistemas que propongo por aquí. Entonces, con eso termino mi presentación. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, doctor Armando. Eh, Muchísimas gracias. Pues entonces abriríamos el espacio para la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. So here we can read or listen to you guys if you have questions concerning the topics that we have checked. Thanks. So you, claro, Dennis,
Yeah,
you,
so questions for Christian. You know, I'm going to ask a question that my students ask me. How does something, so absolutely nothing, you describe it as self-negating, but how does nothing negate itself? Sorry, Christian, are you there?
Yes. I wasn't sure if there was some further elaboration. Yeah.
I could elaborate
okay.
more. I mean,
Yeah, that's fair.
Oh yeah. He
It
talks
makes
about it
sense.
like yeah, it's, God is, as an absolute has to negate itself to the point of realizing it's Satan. So all things are self-negating. But then how is nothing itself self-negating? How is nothing negate itself? It's nothing. It's absolutely nothing. It's no thing. I don't like the translation absolutely nothingness. It sounds like a thing. But what do you mean? It's absolutely no thing. Mu.
Right. I initially I just want to maybe like turn the question around and say like how could nothingness not negate itself, right? Because I think that's actually sort of getting at the issue that
Well,
you're
the burden of
identifying,
proof
which is
Nishida to demonstrate that that
right. But the point being that like if Nishida is actually talking about something that isn't anything, right? Like it couldn't but negate itself in the sense that if it didn't, it would be a thing, right? Like a pure identity is equivalent to an object or really being, right? If nothingness wasn't self-negating, then it would be an object. It would be a consistent, self-consistent identity. Um, and I and so therefore it has to be self-negating in order to not be anything at all. But I think maybe there's a question of, and I guess I haven't worked this out entirely so robustly, but there'd probably be a question of like when we're talking about absolute nothingness self-negating, there's a maybe an intuition to imagine it as sort of metaphysical process where you have this object that then does this thing to itself within time as a sort of causal sort of process. But I think what Nishida is talking about is not like that. I mean, it's obviously operating at this like sort of like, a priori transcendental sort of register. So, I mean, the way that I think about it is sort of like like an unstable, like intrinsically unstable sort of fissuring. It's this like blur. I mean, but it's not like an object that does a thing to itself. So I don't know if that distinction is satisfying, but I think that's already sort of gesturing in the direction of an answer. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm still working through this myself, trying to understand what is exactly mu. I mean, I
Yeah.
can in the words that he explains it to me, but if I want to put it in my own words and try to think deeper about it, that's where I struggle, and that's why I asked that question. So let's continue to talk about this over drink sometime.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to say too, yeah. That like the question of like okay, like is it a misnomer to translate absolute nothing or mu as absolute nothingness or zeta mu as absolute nothingness? I mean to my understanding, it would like the same problem would arise no matter what you're talking about. I mean, if you use a different word to translate it, well, you just it just becomes another object. I mean, this is maybe like a sort of failure of language. So I think what matters is not necessarily the word that we use to translate Nishida's term, but what matters is that it's a term that entails a certain intrinsic negativity that then generates this structure that's self-negating, right? Like I think because Nishida says what he's talking about is self-negating, he sort of avoids the charge that he's objectifying what he's talking about, however we translate it, if that makes sense. So yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
because we call it emptiness or anything else, it'd just be the same issue, right? So anyway, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Now we've got a question from Javier Aranda, doctor. Yeah.
Could you wait a minute? I just got stuck with a cable, so just in a minute I'll ask my question.
Okay, sure. Yeah, of course. Um, so we can also read the questions on Facebook in case someone has something to say. Um,
Okay, then I'm sorry. Okay, well, first I would like to congratulate everyone for this amazing presentation. Congratulations, Artur. It was a really great exposition what you did there. And Armando, it was a really nice, muy buena presentación, Armando. Muchas gracias. And Christian, I wanted to talk to you about. I was remembering the emails that we shared some weeks ago. And I was thinking about this. Well, I kept thinking about that actually. So one of the ways that I think that I kind of grasp the idea is that maybe in going from I don't know. I was thinking going from Fichte and Husserl and then going to Nishida instead of going directly to an directly to that religious root of the experience, right? And I was thinking, well, in Fichte, you have this idea of the I as a pure metaphysical root, right? And then you have the theoretical or transcendental I, and then you have the concrete I. So in reading at or looking at Husserl, it seems like he's trying to grasp the how the transcendental I could act as a ground for the concrete I, or anyways, like going from the concrete I to the theoretical I, right? And then I was thinking maybe what Nishida is doing with that notion of experience is not taking the I as a theoretical construct, but actually taking that level, that theoretical level, that is pure experience, as the level that construct the subject, as the activity of construction of the subject. So that will be pure experience in a way that is not a concrete I, but is actually that pure levelness of subject construction, right? In that regard, I think that that will be really difficult to put into words, because we are trying to say what is pure to the subject without being actually a subject, because a subject is like an I or something like that, right? And then I was thinking that maybe this is the self-negating part, because in order to be an I, it needs to be self-negated, so the I can give way, and this will perpetuate a nothingness. And it will be a problem of conceptualization more than a problem of language, because how can we talk about that which is an I without being an I, right? I don't know if this makes any sense to you, and what do you think about it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's really great. And so I actually think, okay, because this is something I felt sort of, I don't know, like guilty about, in my presentation, because I was like, well, okay, like, it's dialectics and it's realism. Okay, so like, what does it matter, right? And I think actually, like, what you're articulating is like, wow, I think an important sort of consequence of, and actually Nishida is like, he actually himself says this, I think at the end of the essay, Human Being, or one of them from that era. Is that what he's doing is he's maintaining intelligibility in the context of realism. Like that's what the dialectical aspect sort of enables, which I think is really important, right? So, okay, so to recap, I like if I'm sort of understanding sort of the problem space that you're identifying, which is also I think there in Kant, right? Is that like if the transcendental I is if it's grounding empirical knowledge and the concrete self, but it's also inaccessible. Like it seems to be like a gulf between the very thing that's conditioning this as a possibility, right? And so there's this sort of ineliminable gap, and then this creates an issue, right? I think what's cool about what Nishida's doing is, so it's interesting. Like he's starting from pure experience, like that's his sort of epistemological sort of standpoint. But when you're doing philosophy, when you're, writing words, and you're writing an essay, you really are operating at the level of, I mean, really the basho of judgment, like the last basho. That's what words are doing, right? So in a sense, he's philosophizing from experience forward, if you want to put it that way, and he's theorizing from words backward, And the question is like, well, what justifies like, okay, I mean, meditation will grasp the absolute probably better than anything. What would justify philosophy? And what he says, basically, especially in his dialectical period, is that the self-negation of absolute nothingness conditions its theoretical thematization insofar as it's self-negating, right? Because, negation creates mediation. Absolute nothingness is in itself self-mediating through its own negation. Thought emerges as a moment within that broader process of mediation, right? So he talks about thematization theory as emerging in the negative direction of the negation of absolute nothingness. So, nothingness negates itself. It sort of furnishes identifiable forms. Thought is one such of those forms, and it is also able to thematize those forms itself. So what I'm saying here is that what's cool about what Nishida is doing, especially in terms of dialectical realism, is that typically like if you say the world is intelligible, you either are going to have some sort of adequatio, sort of like, mind-world correspondence, but that's after Kant not available. So then how do you say that the world is knowable? The idealists say that the world is knowable because they identify thinking and being. The world is knowable because it's fundamentally conceptual. And then if you want to be like a strong sort of post-Kantian realist, in a non-dialectical sense, you have to say something like, well, science can maybe talk about the world, but it's always a sort of deictic. It's always pointing towards something that's not actually really encapsulating. Nishida's like, no, the world is self-negating. It's not reducible to us. So thought can think something that isn't it. But that's because the thing that isn't thought is itself self-negating. So the very mediation that we use to think about the world is the mediation that the world is. But that mediation, that negativity is not reducible to us. So we get both realism, mind independence, the world is not reducible to us, and intelligibility, which you don't get otherwise, except with idealism, reducing the world to thinking. So that's what I think is really cool about what Nishida's position is doing. There's other consequences he draws, but I think that's one of the more important ones. And I want to say, yeah, I thought our email exchange was like very, it's like old school like philosophical letters or something. Like, anyway, thank you. I don't know if that's a clear answer, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I really want to keep talking about this, but I was looking at the clock and I think we are over the limit. So, yeah, there's still the next round of expositions. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, guys. Pues muchísimas gracias. Thank you so much, guys. They were awesome presentations. Congratulations to each of you. So we will go and move forward to our next three following sessions by Jiro Inohara, Dennis Strombeck, and Javier Aranda. So we will move with the next moderator, con el siguiente moderador.
Soy yo.
Great. Bien. Adelante, gracias.